Colliery district that you have a map of, or well, some people have a map of, then that shows off most of the places I'm going to be talking about are indicated in that. Now, the Leinster Colliery district was an upland area straddling the Kilkenny and Queen's County borders, with a bit of it in County Carlow. Economically, through coal haulage, it was linked with Athy, Carlow Town, Loughlin and Kilkenny City. There were three main collieries: Clough, Newtown and Castlecomer. There were a lot of smaller ones as well, an awful lot. Newtown was rented by the Grand Canal Company until 1831. Castlecomer was part of the Wansford estate, and Clough was part of the Bryan estate. There doesn't appear to have been much conflict in the Clough colony. There's one small strike recorded there in the winter of 1833, so I won't be talking about that too much. Now, it was quite well populated at the time, and there was 500 people working in Newtown Colliery in 1832, about 250 working in the Castlecomer Colliery in 1828, but that was actually mining coal itself. There was many more people who would have been working hauling the coal to Carlow and to Kilkenny City. Now, in the late 1820s and early 1830s, the Colliery district was one of the main centres of the Whitefield movement. The Whitefield movement would have been one of a long series of movements in late 18th and early 19th century Ireland, where bands from the subaltern classes of rural society attempted to regulate socio-economic conditions to better meet their needs, and usually through violent, clandestine and direct action. And a common generic term for these movements is white boys or white boys. So the white people are one of a whole series. Now I'm going to talk about three major disputes which form the backdrop to the development of the Whitefield movement. Now it should be noted that a lot of day-to-day Whitefield activity would not have been connected to these disputes, but to more minor land occupancy disputes or raids for firearms. But these were the major conflicts in that they involved large numbers of people. And the major conflicts I'm going to be speaking about were those in the Commons of Fossey, in Newtown Colliery and the townland of Clonbrook, and in the Castlecomer Collieries. And the sources for this research is local newspapers, which is self-explanatory, and the Chief Secretary Office registered papers outraged State of the Country sections, which is communications from magistrates and the police to Dublin Castle. The prior ones for the state papers, that being the estate that the Castlecomer Collieries were part of. The minute books of the Court of Directors of the Grand Canal, which is the only available records of the Grand Canal. They have them in the National Archives, but they haven't been fully catalogued yet, as the Grand Canal Company owns or rented Newtown Colliery. And finally, you have the report from the Select Committee on the State of Ireland, which was a parliamentary select committee looking at disturbances in Ireland in the summer of 1832. And the Select Committee was actually mostly about the Queen's County, because it was the two MPs from the Queen's County that set it up, but then they kind of expanded it to include a bit on Westmeath and Clare as well, but mostly about Queen's County. Now, I'll get on to talk about the Commons of Fossey. The Commons of Fossey was located just above the northwest perimeter of the Colliery district, and it's the part of it is the hill you can see in the background there. It was part of the Cosby estate, which was centred on Stradbally. It's where the Cosbys are the people who run Electric Picnic still today. They still own part of Stradbally. Now the Commons of Fossey was seemingly cleared of its inhabitants around about 1826 or 1827, though this may have been a drawn-out process rather than a single event happening that year. And this is a very murky event. It's very difficult to get a handle on what happened due to the lack of surviving estate records. Now the three Roman Catholic Queen's County clergymen who give evidence to the Select Committee on the State of Ireland that I was speaking of a moment ago in the summer of 1832 all ascribe a leadership role in the Whitefield movement to people who were evicted from the Cosby estate from the clearance of the Commons of Fossey. But I found no record of any resistance actually directly connected to this eviction. Of course, that may just mean a lack of record, most likely doesn't, a lack of record. Now, commons at this time were areas with shared usage rights, and mostly areas of upland pasture. In other instances at this time, like famously in the Sugarloaf and in Dalkey, commonses were being enclosed both by landlords and by squatters, and it's likely that this is what was happening in the commons of Fossey. There's one surviving document from the Cosby estate that mentions it, which is an 1811 document called Rental and Observations, etc. on the Lordship of Timahoe. And you get the impression from that the commons of Fossey was a community of either very poor subtenants with no rent to pay to the proprietor, or squatters. And I'll just read a bit of it out to you there. It describes the people who live there as a number of poor, many of them lawless miscreants. And then says the commons are attached to several farms in the usual way for grazing the tenants' cattle. They have, however, been divided by the tenants and some of the inhabitants and informed to pay rent, but the greater part no. It is difficult to make any estimate of their value, but to me, I am afraid it can be but of little. Now, one would have to imagine the Fossey clearance was a seminal event in the development of the Whitefield. This is especially the case given the colourful description of the place and its inhabitants by a local magistrate, mine owner Hovington Stapleton. And this is how he described the place. I can go back as far as the year 1798. That was a place, the resort of the principal rebels and robbers of the Queen's County. If you wanted to catch a desperate character, that was the place to go. And I think I recall 18 fellows out being convicted at Maryborough at one assize. And similarly, John Edge, who went on to be leaseholder of Newtown Colliery, called it a place notorious for bad characters. Now, of course, to some extent, this is an attempt to mitigate or justify the Cosbys clearing these people off their land. Also, however, there was a gap of 2 or 3 years between this clearance and the commencement of overt white-boy activity by the Whitefield. So it's as yet unclear what the exact relationship was between the clearance of the commons of Fossey and the development of Whitefield. I'm just going to move on to Newtown Colliery and the townland of Clonbrook. I'm just going to show you some pictures of Newtown. Now, these two roads here are the two roads that most of the coal pits were on. This is from the 1840s Ordnance Survey map. You can see there's a steam engine indicated there, and these little round circles here are all coal pits. I'll be talking later about how they had a proliferation of coal pits rather than, you know, the one deep shaft that we associate with coal mines now. That's one of those roads today. If you go down it, you wouldn't imagine that it's anything other than a country road in rural Ireland. Though, as it was pointed out to me, it was very straight by the standards of rural Ireland. And that's the area where the coal pits were, and at the end of that road, now it has hydroelectric power. Not hydroelectric. What's that called? Wind power. That's it. Completely different. Hey, I don't do science. Anyways, the lease of Newtown Colliery and the adjoining townland of Clonbrook was held by the Grand Canal Company. In 1830, they sought to surrender the lease to the proprietors Bowen and Leckie. That Leckie would have been the parents of the Leckie who went on to be the famous historian and whose statues in Trinity College. Anyways, Bowen and Leckie demanded that the lands be cleared of subtenants before it was handed back to them. There were 191 tenements in Clonbrook, most of which would have been the habitations of colliery workers and their families. Now, in September 1830, the company issued notices to quit, and it appears met with immediate opposition. John Edge was then the manager of Newtown Colliery and the manager of Newtown Colliery and Clonbrook Farm for the Grand Canal Company, and he acted as his agent in serving the notices. In a letter of the 8th of September 1830, Edge, far from raising objections to the clearance, actually cancels this as a course of action. But on the 24th of September, a couple of weeks later, after he has delivered the notices to quit, he seems to completely backtrack. In a letter of the 24th of September, Edge predicts, turning out so many people will be the cause of serious disturbance in the country. And it's likely while he was serving the notices, he was made very aware at first hand of the extent and depth of opposition and clearance was likely to face. Now, the larger part of the tenantry was to give up possession on the 25th of March 1831, and all tenants bar 5 refused to leave their homes. Now, around this time, Edge painted a very forbidding picture of the situation, writing, "There are considerable numbers of bad tenants in the land who have not and who will not pay rent. In fact, they have nothing, and they not only keep possession, but are a continual pest to their neighbours, their chief support being plunder. It would be best to turn out such by a few at a time, and although much loss and annoyance would be caused by suffering bad characters to remain for a time, still it would be preferable to insurrection." Again, he's probably slightly overplaying his hand in his emphasis there. The following month, Edge reaches an agreement with the proprietors Bound and Lecky for him to take on the leasehold of Newtown Colliery and Clonbrook Farm and Clonbrook Townland. So there was no vacant possession given to Bound and Lecky. This probably had the effect of both emboldening the ordinary tenants of the area and their neighbours in regard to any further opposition they make to any other measure. It also probably made Edge more popular. In fact, Edge, unlike other operators of collieries, didn't flee the area when the Whitefield movement reached its height. His neighbour, Hopkins Stapleton, for example, you could see me quote, fled. It's also notable that a so-called threatening notice from Clonbrook from October 1831 is conciliatory in its attitude towards Edge. And there was an issue with Edge seeking rent arrears, which is mentioned in the letter, which opens thus. "Mr. John Edge gave no arrears of rent any more from the poor tenants. Any man who will pay it, he shall be no more. But let him pay his half year's rent, and if he does not, he must lose house and land, and I will assist Mr. Edge with 700 men." Like, note the respectful tone and conciliatory content of that letter. Like, it's offering compromise and even offers to police compromise. Edge appears to have acceded to these threats and stopped trying to collect rent arrears. Now, I think in Edge's willingness to factor in the possibility of popular resistance into his consideration of how best to run Newtown Colliery and Clonbrook Farm and Clonbrook Townland, we have an indication that the activities of movements such as the Whitefield exerted an influence on the policies of even larger employers and landlords. I think in his willingness to make concessions and compromises, Edge was possibly acting in the accepted and expected fashion for a landlord to behave. It is noticeable that landlords who behaved as if they had obsolete rights as proprietors were both the victims of retaliatory violence, and magistrates largely blamed them for being the victims of retaliatory violence. So there's a contrast between their behaviour and the behaviour of Edge, and also in how people behaved towards them. I'm just going to give you some examples of this contrast with Edge. There was a Hackett who held 300 acres in Slat Upper, also from the Bown and Lecky estate. And in September 1832, the magistrate based in the Queen's County portion of the Colliery district, Matthew Singleton, commented on his behaviour thus: "During the week, Mr. Hackett sent down from Dublin a man to serve several tenants on his property ejectment notices. Such proceedings on his part just now I consider very indiscreet, and is sufficient to add fuel to the flame amongst the inhabitants in that part of the country. He has complained frequently during the summer to the government and to me that he could not exercise any ownership over his property in that part of the country, and I was myself, with the aid of the police, obliged to take possession of his estate since I came to the district. If he should persist in these proceedings, he will find it impossible to manage his property here. The gentleman that is now in the land and superintending the leases sent a process server back to Dublin with the notices and denounced such conduct as most mischievous." In a similar note to that, in a similar contrast from Edge, there was a threatened eviction of tenants from the lands of Ballylahane, which was met by the assassination of their landlord Thomas Gregory in August 1831. Local magistrate and mine owner Hobbins and Stapleton said of Gregory that he was excessively harsh to the people and committed several acts upon the unfortunate people there that they should be sorry to be guilty of, and acts of injustice. And similarly, another magistrate, D.I. Donahue, said of him that he was an attorney of some eminence, although a man of great tact and cleverness in professional matters, he appears to have managed his private concerns with little discretion. Through some acts of oppression, he rendered himself exceedingly obnoxious to his tenants and neighbours, so much so that a conspiracy against his life has been for some time past concocted. So perhaps in Newtown Colliery and Clonbrook, we're seeing the normal expected behaviour of a landlord in Edge's willingness to compromise, in his awareness of the possibility of serious opposition, and his plans to proceed with any changes in a piecemeal fashion. We're also perhaps seeing how that behaviour was shaped from below, in that Edge was conceding to a threat, at least he was conceding to a threat in regards to the rent arrears. It's going to move on to the Castlecomer collieries now. The Castlecomer collieries would have went over a larger area than the Clock Colliery or Newtown Colliery. All these townlands that I've indicated with the circles here were all places where there would have been coal pits that were part of the Castlecomer collieries. Now, conflict in the Castlecomer collieries from 1826 onwards revolved around an ambitious restructuring programme embarked on by the owners. Now, the goal of this programme was to phase out small shallow pits controlled by contractors known as master colliers and replace them with a smaller number of larger, deeper pits directly controlled by agents of the proprietor. The purpose of these changes were manifold: to more thoroughly extract coal, to reduce labour costs, to reduce damage to agricultural land, and to better orientate production to market conditions. A new management team was brought over from the north of England to oversee this. I'll just go in more detail into that now. What would have been existing in the Castlecomer collieries and in some of the other collieries in the area was what was called bell pit mining. Bell pit mining is not exactly open cast with shovels, but it's only kind of a step up from that. We're talking about really small, shallow pits and a proliferation of them, rather than the deep shaft going down to a labyrinth that we associate with mining today. They wouldn't have had proper ventilation, and they wouldn't have had a very effective means of pumping out the water. Because what happens in mining, you dig down a certain amount, you hit the water table, your mine floods. So pumping out water is very important. And just this is reflected in this map from 1801. You see these little rectangles here are all coal pits. Like, there's just a complete proliferation of them, and you can understand the damage if you get into agricultural land. Now, what this programme of change meant for rank and file workers in the collieries was tougher, more physically demanding labour, job losses, and possibly a more regimented and disciplinarian management style. What it meant for the master colliers, who were kind of like tenants who controlled coal pits, aside from their planned phasing out, which they may not have known about, they had more stricter contractual terms, and they also got to control less pits. What it meant for the carmen is what they call coal hauliers, the people who brought coal to Tennessee and to Florida with horses and carts. What it meant for them is it made it more difficult to reappropriate coal from the pits. And what they used to do was, go in there at night time when no one was watching, and take coal for themselves and sell it in the market for themselves rather than supply it to the owners. It was more difficult to do this in the new system. Now, there was a strike in the new workings in June and July 1829, and probably another strike in February 1832. It's harder to know what's going on in 1832 because there's less estate records for the period, and we're more dependent on newspapers. In June 1829, shots were fired at one of the English engineers, and a so-called threatening letter sent to the managers. And then in March 1832, Thomas Potts, an engineer and overseer, was shot dead, and he was one of the guys brought over from Newcastle. Following this, work in the new pits was brought to a halt, and in the resulting context of unemployment, there was a mass reappropriation of coal from the pits. People just seem to have gone in there and taken coal and brought it to the market for themselves. Now, in the end, the restructuring programme was shelved. The results were described by prolific popular authors and the Halls who visited Castlecomer in the early 1840s and wrote about it in their account of their travels in Ireland. And what they had to say was, the collieries of Kilkenny seem rather to be in a retrograding condition, but certainly no symptoms of radical improvement are visible. The proprietors have abandoned their works, not wishing to risk either their lives or properties in the introduction of a new method which, although tending materially to ameliorate the condition of the colliers and working men, would nevertheless be strenuously opposed by the great majority of them as an invasion of their rights. How am I doing for time, Brian? Time for time? Okay. Now that was some elements of one strand of my research, which is looking at the material origins of Whitefield movement in the Leinster Colliery district. There's another strand that I've going to include a bit on because I wasn't quite sure of time, so I added on a little addendum, which is done part of my research at the moment, which is looking at the mentality or social attitudes of movement participants as revealed in so-called threatening letters. I've been working through a collection of threatening letters, not just from the Queen's County and Kilkenny, but from all Leinster counties. And one of the things I'm interested in looking at in those threatening letters is the extent of class consciousness, because it's it's an issue in the historiography as to whether these were class-based movements, which I think they were to some degree, and whether they had a class consciousness. And I believe they did. So I've got some parts of so-called threatening letters to show you here. These were actually more like notices which were posted up in public places. The first one was posted up outside a church, for example. And I think they show a degree of class consciousness, but in a very kind of embryonic and localized fashion. So the first one is an extract from a very large document that was posted up outside a church in Towlerton, which is on your map, in February 1832. And it reads, "You are hereby required to take notice that there has been lodged with the secretary of these 4 parishes complaints of the many grievances practised and intended to be practised against the poor by the uncharitable and tyrannical habits of the middle classes. Those whom I allude to is the haughty and insolent farmers who rejoice at their fellow Christian man being reduced to the state of wretchedness which he labours under." And then there's another one from Rathangan, which is kind of middle Kildare, which just says, "Take notice, the oppressed labourers of Athy are complaining of the oppression of the employers." There's one from Loughlin Bridge, Carlow, which was just signed, "Labourers of Loughlin." And then this next one from Kildare, which has actually been previously published. I think it was in Stephen Randolph Gibbons' book. But this is quite interesting in that most of these notices are handwritten and like basically produced in a fairly primitive manner. This and one other I found was printed, and it was distributed in multiple copies all over Kildare. And it reads, "Take notice that we will no longer bear the oppression of paying double rent to farmers for land, and the gentleman so favourable to the poor. Therefore, all farmers will be obliged to return their undertakes to the head landlord at the same rates at which they hold the land themselves. And we trust the gentleman will not allow them any longer to tyrannise over the poor of this impoverished nation." I don't really have a conclusion on account of adding that little addendum in, but sometimes life doesn't have a conclusion. So that's what I'm researching at the moment. One half of it is the kind of material conditions that the Whitefield movement developed within the Leinster Colliery district, part of which was what happened in Bossy, Newtown, and Castlecomer, but there was lots of other things happening as well, and the other part of which is the mentality of movement participants and, well, what we can see of the mentality of the rural poor of the time as expressed in threatening letters. We'll just take any questions. Comments.